Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to my channel, and this is going to be the second video in my series on metaphysics, and if you haven't seen the first video in the series, I highly recommend you do so, otherwise you may get confused. Now, today we're going to be looking at act and potency, and the distinction that lies in between each of those. We're going to be looking at what that means, why it's important to us, as well as some special aspects and technicalities that exist in it. Now, those technicalities could get fairly complex very quickly, but I'm going to try and keep it very simple. Also, I'm heavily drawing in this video from Edward Feser's book, The Last Superstition, and I will paraphrase/quote some sections in the book because I think they best explain and lay forth the ideas that we will be discussing today. I'm kind of basing my metaphysics series off that book, so don't be surprised if I draw a lot from it in the future videos as well. So let's get started. Now, it might shock a lot of people to think that cause and effect can have so much going on today. I mean, most people think that just cause and effect is very simple to understand, and that's all there is to it. But that's not really the case. One of the pre-Socratic philosophers, named Parmenides, believed that the world never changed and pitted his reason against his senses. Most of us are probably thinking that this position, that nothing ever changes, is absolutely ridiculous. But then again, a lot of things some philosophers hold are really ridiculous and seem contradictory to common sense. Parmenides' argument for this position was that something can't come from nothing, but that nothing was the only thing something new could come from, since the only thing there is, other than what already exists, is non-being or nothing, hence nothing new can come into existence and change is impossible. Basically, what Parmenides is saying here is that stuff that exists here and now is in being, but for anything to change, then something would have to come into existence, and the only thing that it could come from would be non-being. This is because it doesn't already exist in some way, according to Parmenides, and since something can't come from nothing, change is impossible. If you're wondering about that claim of whether something can come from nothing, go ahead and check out my 3-part series titled Can Something Come From Nothing? It's a pretty comprehensive covering on the topic, and I think you guys will enjoy it. Now, to contrast Parmenides' view, there was a person called Heraclitus who believed that everything was always changing. You can see that these are two extremes, one saying that nothing ever changes, and another saying that stuff always changes. Now, typically, when you have two extremes, finding a common point in between them is the correct answer, as is also the case when some people who say that everything happens by necessity, and others say everything happens by chance. Now, what we're going to be doing is to try and find a middle ground that was proposed by Aristotle and move forward with that, which is pretty well what all the philosophers did up into the Enlightenment. So, Aristotle says that change is comprised of things going from potentially being a certain way to actually being a certain way. For example, an unlit match is potentially lit but not actually lit. But if something were to actualize that potential of it being able to be lit, then the match would be lit. The potential of that match to be lit exists in a certain sense. Now, Parmenides would say that that would be impossible because he claimed that the potential does not exist, only what is actual does. Aristotle would respond with something like, even if the match isn't actually lit, the potential for it to be lit does exist, and this together with some external influence that actualizes this potential suffices to show how the change can occur. Now, this is also referencing one of Aristotle's 4 causes, that being the efficient cause, but that would take a whole nother video to go over the 4 causes, which I do hope to do in the future. And when I say that the potentialities exist in a certain sense, we have not gone over how they exist or where they exist, which I hope to do in a future video, but that is a very technical topic, so that's all we're going to say in this video. Now I'm going to play about a 4-minute clip from Classical Theist. He's a great YouTuber, definitely check him out. But in this video, he further refines act and potency and delves into what can be grasped from contemplating on the distinction between them. This section of the video is not necessary for the rest of the video, but if you want to stretch your intellectual faculties a little further, then I highly recommend you watch this. Also, if you just like seeing past the surface of things and want to get into the nitty-gritty, then you're definitely going to want to watch this. Otherwise, just skip ahead in the video.
Now, potency, thus, puts a limit on act and restricts it to this or that mode of actuality. With this said, though, there's nevertheless a difficulty. How is it that realizable being and realized being can both enjoy equal status of being real? Is not that which is squarely within what is actually realized? How does it make sense to say that potential being actually has reality if it's not actual? I think this is a good way to show the real value of metaphysics and how this isn't just a pie-in-the-sky abstraction, because this distinction between actuality and potentiality, or act and potency, when you really reflect on the implications of this distinction, actually serves as the basis for how we can come to know the very existence of God. For if actual being is that which is, outside of which is what is not, then in order for potential being to be real, it would have to be grounded in actual being, or actuality. But in order for this to be the case, what is actual would have to be, at the same time, realized, yet also realize what is only realizable, which is absurd. As St. Thomas says, a thing cannot be both an act and potency at the same time and in the same respect. So, what can realize potency if not actuality that is limited by potency? What if there was a third option in this equation? Let's put it in the form of a syllogism. Premise 1. Actual being is that which is, outside of which is what is not. Premise 2. If there is only limited actuality, then that which limits it, potential being, can only be non-being, since that which is absolutely speaking outside of actual being is that which is not. Premise 3. Potential being is not non-being. It's a real feature of the world. It's a real aspect of reality. So premise 4, therefore, there has to be unlimited actuality, which can ground both the reality of limited actual being and potential being, and this is what we would call God. Now, this has to be the case because if there is only limited actuality, then that which limits it would be outside of the sphere of actuality, and therefore would be reduced to non-being. So the reductio ad absurdum is on the supposition that all you have is limited act and potency. But so since actual being is the source of a thing's very presence in reality, if there is a principle that limits it, and thus is really distinct from it, namely potency, then either it is outside of actual being, absolutely speaking, or only outside limited actual being, whereby limited actual being and potency both derive their reality from pure, unlimited actuality itself, which is what we mean by the essence of God. This is just one example of how carefully thinking through a simple, taken for granted banality of change, for example, can drive the mind into the depths of reality where God is awaiting to be discovered.
Now, this distinction between actuality and potentiality allows us to see how change can occur and refutes Parmenides' position as well as Heraclitus' position. Now, this may seem rather pointless, but we can use it to eventually show that the logical outcome would be an unmoved mover, aka God, although we're going to go about it a different way than what classical theists did in his video you just watched, but definitely check out his entire video because it is very informative. Now we're going to examine some of those pesky technicalities, so put on your thinking cap and let's get right into it. And I must note before I start speaking here that I'm going to directly quote from Edward Feser's The Last Superstition here, because as I said in the introduction, I just think that his way of explaining things is in the simplest terms, yet the most profound way. Also, Edward Feser uses a slightly different analogy comprised of saying that there is a rubber ball and it has the potential for gooiness, yet it needs to be actualized by something outside the ball, aka heat. This will help you understand what he's saying in just a second. So, no potential can actualize itself, and in this sense, anything that changes requires something outside of it to change it. This is true even of animals which seem at first glance to change themselves, for what this always amounts to is really just one part of the animal being changed by another. The dog, quote-unquote, moves itself across the room, but only insofar as the potential motion of the legs of the dog is actualized by the flexing of the leg muscles, and their potential to be flexed is actualized by the firing of the motor neurons, and the potential of the motor neurons to fire is actualized by the other neurons, and so on and so forth. Thus, we have the classical Aristotelian principle: whatever is changed by another, or in its more traditional formulation, whatever is moved by another. Now, it must be noted here that when Aristotelians speak of motion, they are not merely speaking of local motion, but change more generally. So whenever they say whatever is moved by another, they are really just saying something like whatever is changed by another. This is the more archaic meaning of the word, but it's important for us to understand how they're using it. And also, a side note here, a lot of people want to say that this is odd and weird, and why do they do that? But in reality, we're the ones being odd and weird because we changed the definition. Just kind of something funny to think about. Another technicality is that while actuality and potentiality are fully intelligible only in relation to each other, there is an asymmetry between them, with actuality having metaphysical priority. A potential is always a potential for a certain kind of actuality. For instance, potential gooiness is just the potential to be actually gooey. Furthermore, potentiality cannot exist on its own, but only in combination with actuality. Hence, there is no such thing as potential gooiness all by itself. This would kind of be what classical theists refer to as prime matter, but that's kind of besides the point. But only in something like an actual rubber ball can potential gooiness be found. It is incoherent to speak of something existing and being purely potential with no actuality whatsoever, but it is not incoherent to speak of something as purely actual with no potentiality. Indeed, for Aristotle, there is such a being, namely God, but we're going to talk about this in another video. So while for us to understand actuality and potentiality, we need to contrast them with each other, in the real world outside our minds, actuality can exist on its own, while potentiality cannot. And again, we're going to be talking about this in a future video, so don't stress about it or anything, but it's just something to note now. Now, I want you guys to see a quote here that is actually the first of the well-known 24 Thomistic theses. I will have a link in the description to a page listing all of them, but in this quote, it says, "Potency and act divide being in such a way that whatever is either pure act or of necessity is composed of potency and act as primary and intrinsic principles." Now, what's cool is there's actually people who've made shirts with this saying on there, so it's kind of like a classical theist, Thomistic reference that not many people get, but it's fairly funny, and once you know it, you may see it one day, so give a shout out to anybody if you see him with a shirt on. Alright, and now this is the last technicality, so give yourselves a pat on the back, take a breather, get ready for this, and this one is really just the most boring one of all, but it needs to be said. A thing's various actualities and potentialities exist in a layered fashion and constitute a hierarchy. Also, I will now demonstrate with a paragraph full of somewhat dry technical distinctions. For example, since you are a human being, you are a rational animal. Because you are a rational animal, you have the power or faculty of speech. And because you have this power, you sometimes exercise it and speak. Your actually having the power of speech flows from your actually being a rational animal. It is a quote-unquote secondary actuality relative to your being a rational animal, which is a primary actuality. And your actually exercising that power on some occasion is in turn a secondary actuality relative to your having the power, which, at least relative to the actual exercise of it, is primary. Now, what that's basically saying is, for you to even be able to speak, to even have that potential to speak, you first need to have the actuality of being a rational animal, because if you don't have the actuality of being a rational animal, then you're not going to have the potentiality to speak. So while this may seem like a dry kind of what's the point distinction, it's actually very important. And this can be used to refute a lot of dumb objections where people say like, well, this bouncy ball has the potential to bounce to the moon, but there is nothing intrinsic to it that is capable of producing that effect. It would have to have some other nature to be able to bounce to the moon, which he makes in this point in his book. Just check it out if you get a chance. And finally, note that you do have this power of speech even if you don't ever exercise it, such as when you're sleeping or competing in a breath-holding contest. There are similar distinctions to be drawn with respect to potentiality. Suppose you don't speak German, nevertheless you have the potential to speak it in the sense that you might learn it. Call this a first potentiality for speaking German. Now, even once you do learn it, you won't, of course, be speaking it all the time, even though you could speak it at any particular moment if you wanted to. You thus now have the potential to speak German in another sense. Call this a secondary potentiality for speaking German. Now, acquiring this second sort of potentiality for speaking German, the ability to speak it at will, is also, of course, a kind of actuality, insofar as you now actually have the ability to speak it. So a second potentiality is also a kind of primary actuality, and when you really do go ahead and speak German, exercising your new ability, the act of speaking counts as secondary actuality relative to this primary actuality. Whew, what a tongue twister. I mean, that's very dry technical distinctions, but if you could follow that, good for you. Now, Edward Feser makes all these points and technicalities, which may seem pointless, but they have very strong implications in the debate over euthanasia and abortion, but I'm not going to be going into those topics in this video, but definitely do a Google search if you want to check that out. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this second video in the series on metaphysics. I promise you that these rather dull distinctions I'm laying out now will allow me to do videos in the future that are far more interesting and have far greater implications. Anyway, let me know whether you guys did or didn't like the video in the comment section below, and if you did, definitely hit that like button as it helps me out a lot and shows me what you guys like. Also, feel free to let me know of any topics you want me to cover next. I don't really have anyone taking me up on that so far, but still waiting for it. And please consider subscribing so that you can stay up to date on all my latest content. It really does help out, guys. As always, God bless.